When Donald Trump threatened sweeping tariffs on Canadian agriculture, most headlines focused on farmers, grain prices, and fertilizer shortages. But that missed the real story. This was never just about wheat, canola, or potash. This was about control. About who owns the arteries of North American trade. About who decides what moves, where it moves, and at what cost. For decades, Canada has been one of the world's most powerful agricultural exporters. Yet it has behaved like a tenant in its own supply chain. It grows the grain, mines the potash, processes the fertilizer, and then hands the logistics to someone else, mostly to the United States. That arrangement looked inefficient but tolerable when trade relations were calm. The moment tariffs entered the conversation, it became something else entirely. It became a strategic liability. Trump's proposal was blunt. Severe tariffs on Canadian grain and fertilizer, publicly framed as a way to support American domestic production. But behind that language was a more uncomfortable reality. The United States does not just buy Canadian agricultural products. It controls a large part of how they reach the world. For years, massive volumes of Canadian grain and fertilizer have moved south first, through American rail networks, terminals, ports, and logistics companies, before being shipped to Europe, Asia, and beyond. Every step of that journey generates fees. Rail fees, port fees, handling fees, insurance, financing, all of it flowing into American balance sheets. Canada does the production. The US controls a critical part of the distribution. As long as politics stayed predictable, this dependency was mostly ignored. It was seen as a cost problem, not a sovereignty problem. That changed the moment Trump began talking about 25% tariffs. Suddenly, the question was no longer how much does it cost, but what happens if they decide to squeeze? Infrastructure that runs through another country always comes with strings attached. And Canada realized very late that a huge portion of its agricultural economy was operating on someone else's leash. To understand the scale of what was at stake, you have to understand Canada's position in global food supply. Canada is not a marginal player. It is one of the pillars of the system. It is the world's largest exporter of potash, accounting for roughly 40% of global exports and around 1/3 of global production, with more than 1 billion tons still underground. Potash is not optional. It is a cornerstone of modern fertilizer. Without it, global crop yields fall sharply. Fertilizer derived from potash supports food production for nearly half of the world's population. That means Canadian mines are directly linked to feeding billions of people. Grain tells a similar story at a different scale. Canada exports roughly 27 to 30 million tons of wheat every year to more than 80 countries, generating over $11 billion annually. It dominates high-protein, high-quality wheat markets, the kind buyers rely on when consistency and performance matter. Add canola, barley, oats, lentils, peas, and specialty crops, and you get a country that sits at the core of global food security. In 2023 alone, Canadian agricultural exports exceeded $99 billion, with long-term growth projections around 3 to 4% per year. These are not symbolic numbers. This is real leverage, real influence, real strategic weight. And yet for decades, the physical pathways that move this food to the world have been shaped by convenience rather than control. Most Western grain goes through Vancouver, a port that is increasingly congested, expensive, and vulnerable to disruption. When it does not go west, it often goes south, into US rail networks and US ports before crossing oceans. Fertilizer from Saskatchewan follows the same pattern. At every step, Canada pays. And at every step, the United States retains leverage without producing a single bushel of wheat or mining a single ton of potash. This structure created a silent asymmetry. Canada carried the production risk. The United States captured a large share of the logistics value and, more importantly, held the choke points. When Trump's tariff threats arrived, that asymmetry turned from an abstract inefficiency into a strategic vulnerability. Because once your exports depend on infrastructure controlled by another country, your trade policy is no longer fully your own. The shock did not come from Washington. It came from a question asked in March 2025, deep in the Canadian prairies. Mark Carney, standing in front of farmers, asked something that should have been obvious decades earlier. Why is Canadian fertilizer still moving through American ports when a shorter, cheaper route to Europe already exists? Why are farmers in Saskatchewan paying US logistics companies while a Canadian Arctic port sits underused? The question landed hard because it exposed something uncomfortable. Canada was not just paying higher costs, it was exporting control. Look at a map, and the problem becomes obvious. There is a deep-water port on Hudson Bay called Churchill. It sits thousands of kilometers closer to Europe than routes through Vancouver or US ports. In theory, it should have been a strategic asset. In practice, it had become a forgotten relic. Underfunded, underused, politically neglected. At one point, its rail line and port were sold to a US company for $1. When flooding damaged the line in 2017, that company walked away. The port went silent. The town was effectively cut off. For years, Churchill was treated as a symbol of failed ambition, but global conditions changed. Shipping costs exploded, congestion worsened, political risk returned. And suddenly, routes that once seemed impractical started to look like insurance. When Trump threatened tariffs, he did not just threaten farmers' margins, he forced a strategic recalculation, and that recalculation pointed north. What looked like a trade dispute was, in reality, the moment Canada realized that it did not truly control the arteries of its own agricultural economy. And once that realization sets in, the question is no longer whether to change the system. The question becomes how fast. The revival of Churchill did not begin with a patriotic speech or a political slogan. It began with spreadsheets, with shipping distances, with fuel costs, with margins. For years, the idea of using an Arctic port had been treated as a romantic but impractical dream. Too cold, too remote, too seasonal, too expensive. But in a world where global logistics had become slower, more congested, and more politicized, the math started to change. And when the math changes, strategy follows. The first major signal came not from Ottawa, but from Saskatchewan. In early 2025, Genesis Fertilizers, a company planning a major nitrogen fertilizer plant in the province, announced a partnership with Arctic Gateway Group, the owner of the Port of Churchill and its rail line. The announcement barely made international headlines, but inside the industry, it landed like a warning shot. Genesis was not talking about a symbolic pilot project. It was talking about restructuring its entire supply chain around Hudson Bay. Under the old model, critical inputs like phosphate and ammonium sulfate were imported through the United States. They moved through American ports, American rail networks, American terminals. The finished fertilizer often followed similar routes on the way out. Every step meant exposure to American fees, American congestion, and American political risk. Under the new model, those same materials would enter Canada through Churchill, and exports to Europe would leave the same way. The United States would be removed from the equation entirely. The volumes made this more than a theoretical exercise. Genesis plans annual production of roughly 1 million tons of fertilizer. That requires around 300,000 tons of imported phosphate every year. Historically, that flow went south first, through American infrastructure, through American ports, through American hands. By shifting that flow north, Genesis was not just saving money, it was insulating itself from policy shocks. The route from Saskatchewan to Europe via Hudson Bay is dramatically shorter than routes that run through Vancouver, California, or the Panama Canal. Fewer miles means lower fuel costs, faster delivery, lower insurance, and less exposure to delays. It also means something else: less vulnerability. When supply chains become weapons, distance is not the only thing that matters. Jurisdiction matters. And Hudson Bay is not under U.S. jurisdiction. This is where the story stops being about one company and starts becoming about a system. Saskatchewan is not a small player in fertilizer. It is one of the central nodes of the global market. If one large producer can anchor its logistics around Churchill and make the economics work, others can follow. And once multiple producers structure their operations around a new route, that route stops being an experiment. It becomes infrastructure. But fertilizer was only the opening move. The real prize is grain. Canada ships close to 29 million tons of grain a year through Vancouver alone. That port is already operating near its limits, with chronic congestion, labor disputes, and rising costs. Churchill, by contrast, has historically handled only a fraction of that, often a few 100,000 tons in its best years. The plan was never to replace Vancouver. The plan was to capture growth, to create a parallel artery that could absorb future volumes and, over time, reshape trade patterns. That plan now has a name: the Port of Churchill Plus project. It includes new grain handling systems, expanded storage, modern loading equipment, and major upgrades to rail capacity. With sufficient icebreaker support, the shipping season could be extended far beyond its historical limits, potentially approaching year-round operations within the next decade. For European markets, the logic is brutally simple. Routing grain through Churchill cuts roughly 6 days off the journey compared to shipping through Vancouver. 6 days means lower logistics costs. It means less spoilage risk. It means better timing for buyers and more predictable delivery schedules. In commodity markets, those advantages translate directly into contracts and pricing power. And then there is the political dimension. Grain grown in Canada, moved on Canadian railways, shipped through a Canadian port, delivered directly to overseas buyers. No American rail networks, no American terminals, no American leverage. The fees stay in Canada. The control stays in Canada. This is where the often quoted figure of roughly $700 to $800 billion enters the conversation. It does not represent the total value of Canadian agriculture. It represents the projected value of trade that could flow through Churchill over the next decade if planned capacity comes online. Saskatchewan's potash exports alone are worth about $5.5 billion per year. If even half of that shifts north over 10 years, that is more than $27 billion. Add a meaningful share of grain exports to Europe and parts of Asia, and the numbers accelerate quickly. Conservative estimates suggest 15 to 20% of current volumes could eventually move through Hudson Bay. That is tens of billions per year in wheat, canola, and specialty crops. Add fertilizer imports and exports. Add critical minerals from northern mines. Add the possibility of future energy exports if Western infrastructure is built. Spread it across a decade, and the cumulative total lands in the high hundreds of billions. The United States will not be cut out entirely. Some routes will always make sense. Some markets will always be served better through traditional corridors. But American ports, railways, and logistics firms that have benefited from Canadian dependence for generations are facing something they have not had to deal with before: competition that also reduces their leverage. And leverage is the real issue. Infrastructure creates behavior. Once companies invest billions into a particular route, they do not abandon it lightly. If Genesis Fertilizers builds its entire operation around Churchill, it will not pivot back because political tensions ease. If grain elevators, storage facilities, and rail upgrades reshape the northern corridor, farmers will use them because efficiency will demand it. The decisions being made now are not tactical. They are structural. They will shape trade patterns for decades. From Washington's perspective, this is an uncomfortable development. There is no clear way to stop it. Canada is not violating trade agreements. It is not closing markets. It is not discriminating against U.S. companies. It is simply investing in its own assets and choosing to use them. Tariff threats meant to extract concessions have instead accelerated diversification. Every ton of fertilizer that bypasses American ports reduces U.S. influence. Every grain shipment that leaves through Hudson Bay weakens the old choke points. The more the system shifts, the harder it becomes to reverse. And yet, none of this is easy. The rail line runs through terrain destabilized by melting permafrost. Flooding and washouts are real risks. The port itself was built in another era and needs massive investment. Icebreaker capacity must expand. Housing and services in a tiny northern community must grow. Skepticism remains strong after decades of failed promises. But what makes this moment different is alignment. Economics, politics, technology, and geography are all pointing in the same direction. Private companies are committing real capital. Provincial governments see diversification as a necessity, not a luxury. And the federal government under Mark Carney has committed $180 million over 5 years to Churchill's infrastructure, signaling that this is no longer a regional experiment. The Arctic route is no longer a backup plan. It is becoming a pillar. And that sets the stage for a much bigger confrontation. Not with words, not with tariffs, but with something far more powerful: irreversible supply chain reality. For most of modern history, power and trade has not come from who produces the goods. It has come from who controls the routes. Empires were not built by growing wheat. They were built by owning ports, canals, railways, and choke points. That is the part of the system the United States quietly inherited in North America. And that is the part of the system Canada is now, slowly but decisively, beginning to take back. What makes the Churchill shift so dangerous for Washington is not the immediate loss of volume. It is the loss of habit. Supply chains are not just pipes. They are behaviors reinforced by billions of dollars of sunk investment. Once companies reorganize their logistics, once contracts are rewritten, once infrastructure is built and optimized around a new route, reversing that flow is extremely expensive and often irrational. Even if political relations improve, the new routes remain because they work. That is why this moment is strategic rather than tactical. Every shipment of fertilizer that enters Canada through Hudson Bay instead of the United States does more than save money. It rewires expectations. Every ton of grain that leaves Churchill instead of passing through American rail networks teaches producers and traders that U.S. infrastructure is optional. And once optional becomes normal, leverage disappears. For decades, American ports, railroads, insurers, and logistics firms have collected billions in fees from Canadian trade without taking production risk. They built entire business models around the assumption that Canadian exports had no realistic alternative routes. That assumption is now being dismantled piece by piece. The numbers involved are not small. Even a partial shift has outsized consequences. If 15 to 20% of Canadian grain and fertilizer exports gradually move north, that represents tens of billions of dollars per year that no longer touch American infrastructure. Over a decade, that becomes hundreds of billions in diverted flows. That is lost revenue for U.S. ports, lost traffic for U.S. railways, lost volume for U.S. logistics companies, lost influence for U.S. policymakers. But the deeper loss is not financial. It is strategic. Control over infrastructure has always given Washington quiet, informal power. Not the kind that appears in treaties, but the kind that shows up in delays, inspections, regulatory pressure, and technical complications when politics turns sour. When your trade depends on someone else's choke points, you are never fully sovereign in your decisions. Canada is learning that lesson now and acting on it. From Washington's point of view, the problem is that there is no clean response. Canada is not breaking rules. It is not closing its market. It is not discriminating against U.S. goods. It is simply using its own geography and investing in its own assets. Any attempt to retaliate would only reinforce the original incentive. To reduce exposure even further, tariffs were supposed to be leverage. Instead, they became a catalyst. This pattern is not unique to agriculture. It is part of a broader global shift where countries are rethinking how much of their economic lifelines should run through someone else's territory. Energy corridors, payment systems, shipping lanes, semiconductor supply chains. The same logic is playing out everywhere. The Churchill Project just happens to be a very visible, very concrete example of what happens when that logic reaches the level of physical infrastructure. The irony is that none of this is driven by ideology. It is driven by risk management. Companies like Genesis Fertilizers are not trying to make political statements. They are trying to make their balance sheets more resilient. Provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta are not trying to pick fights. They are trying to make sure their core industries are not one policy announcement away from disruption. And that is precisely why the shift is so hard to stop. Once risk managers, insurers, and lenders start pricing political exposure into projects, routes that minimize that exposure win. Hudson Bay is not just shorter, it is safer from a geopolitical point of view. That alone changes investment decisions. Of course, the transformation will not be smooth. The rail line to Churchill runs through terrain increasingly affected by melting permafrost. Flooding, sinkholes, and washouts are real and recurring threats. The port itself needs hundreds of millions in modernization. Icebreaker fleets must expand to support longer seasons. A town of fewer than 1,000 people must grow into a logistics hub. These are not trivial challenges. But infrastructure is always expensive at the beginning. The real question is not whether it costs money. The question is whether the alternative is more expensive. For Canada, the alternative is continued dependence on corridors it does not fully control. For the United States, the alternative is watching a structural advantage slowly erode without a clear way to stop it. This is what makes the situation fundamentally different from a normal trade dispute. Tariffs can be negotiated, quotas can be adjusted, rhetoric can cool down. But once physical trade routes shift, once ports, railways, storage facilities, and contracts are built around a new geography, the old system does not automatically come back. The United States will remain an important partner for Canada. Geography guarantees that. Trade will continue. But the era in which Canadian agriculture had no serious alternative to US-controlled corridors is ending. And that has long-term consequences. It means Washington's ability to apply pressure through logistics will be weaker. It means American firms will have to compete on price and service rather than on structural necessity. It means Canadian policymakers will have more room to maneuver in future disputes. Most of all, it means that a threat designed to assert control has, in the long run, done the opposite. By pushing too hard, too openly, the system revealed where it was fragile. And once a system's fragility is exposed, the incentives to rebuild it differently become irresistible. A forgotten Arctic port is not just reopening. It is quietly rewriting the balance of leverage in North American trade.